So you just heard the regulatory picture. It's a lot. And if you're sitting there thinking, how do we actually operationalize all of that? That's exactly the right question. And that's what I'm going to spend the next few minutes kind of talking you through. I'm not going to walk you through a product demo. What I want to give you is a builder's framework, a strategic lens. It's what we use at KID. Because in my view, there's actually three layers of infrastructure that determine whether meeting age requirements becomes a sustainable capability or a permanent fire drill. And here's the thing that the previous sections just made clear, right? It's not a single regulations you solve one time. It's a continuously evolving set of requirements across dozens of markets, and your infra either handles that or it doesn't. So let's talk about like, what does handle that actually look like? The first layer is orchestration. Right? And this is the foundational starting point that everything starts with. Right now, most companies have either implemented, if they've implemented any form of age assurance, they've done it piecemeal, right? One vendor for one market, a custom integration for another. Maybe they have a homegrown solution for a third. And what you end up with is a patchwork, different technical stacks, different verification methods, different data flows, telemetry pipes, reporting. And every time a new regulation hits, you're starting from scratch. Right? It's sort of untenable. That's not a compliance strategy. That's technical debt disguised as progress. So orchestration means ideally a single integration points that routes to the right assurance method based on jurisdiction, the regulatory requirement, and perhaps your own company's risk profile and goals, right? And automatically if possible. So you don't want to hard code by country logic. You want to plug into an infrastructure layer that already knows what Australia requires versus what Brazil requires versus what Texas or Florida or any other US state might require in the future, and just adapt automatically. And why does that matter strategically? Well, hopefully it's clear. It's two reasons. One is speed, right? Joe talked about enforcement compressions happening right now, multiple major deadlines in Q1 and beyond. So if every new market requires a brand new integration, you're going to be challenged to keep up. Orchestration gives you that ability to configure once, integrate once, deploy globally in your products. The second is flexibility. Joe also touched on this, which is the methods themselves are evolving. Governments are trialing new approaches. We have new vendors emerging. Standards are shifting. So if you're hardwired to a single method in your product or you're locked in, right, orchestration gives you the ability to swap, layer, potentially update methods without having to touch your core product. And that's the difference between potentially building on sand or building on infrastructure. Let's talk about interoperability. If orchestration is kind of a builder or operator's challenge and improvement, layer two is about how we solve a user's problem. Because here's the reality we just have to confront, and I think we all know, but let's call a spade, which is age assurance introduces friction. Every time you ask a user to prove their age, there's a cost in time, in trust, in conversion. And if every service asks independently, that cost multiplies. Right? A user who plays 3 games and uses 2 social platforms, they're not going to verify their age 5 separate times, or at least they're not going to want to. They might bounce, maybe they lie, maybe they find other circumvention techniques. So interoperability matters. Verify once, reuse everywhere. The good news is this is not theoretical. The OpenAge Initiative, which has major participants, including Meta, who joined in December of 2025, is building exactly this. A user establishes their age once through a verified process, and that credential travels with them along other participating services within this broader network, right? So no redundant checks, no repeated data collection, no friction stacking. And for us builders, that matters in the 3 following ways. The first is conversion, right? Conversion is king. If a user arrives with an age credential already established, well, your compliance obligation is essentially met before they ever hit sign up. Yay. 2, data minimization. Right? We don't want to be collecting and storing verification data that we don't need to hold, which means less liability and less regulatory surface area. The third is user focus. It's trust. Right? If they've already verified with one service and that carries over, the barrier to using your product just drops significantly. Right? We're just not asking them to start from zero again. We're meeting them where they are. So interoperability is still emerging, but the architecture and decisions we make today, can determine whether or not you participate when it's ready, and it's ready. So this will help us understand if age assurance is a siloed proprietary flow, or if it's going to be rebuilding one that you own later on. So if it's built on an orchestration layer that can accept reusable credentials, you're already well positioned. Third one is adaptation. And actually, this is where it all comes together. Frankly, this is where the real opportunity lives. Layers 1 and 2 solve for establishing age. Layer 3 is about what do you do with that age once you know it? You have obligations, right? Most digital products have young users, not all of them. I mean, there's definitely adult-oriented products, but many of them do. And whether you've designed for them or not, the question is no longer whether to account for the age, but what you do with that once you know. So as we shared earlier, this is now a non-negotiable. It's not enough to just check the age at the door through self-declared age checks. Regulators are looking at whether your product actually behaves differently based on who's using it. Are the ad defaults appropriate? Are monetization mechanics gated correctly? Are social features configured for the right audience? Right? That's what age-appropriate design means in practice, and it's what enforcement is increasingly targeting as well. So you can build this yourself. Right? You can hire a team. You can read every regulation across every market. You can map it to your feature set. You can write that logic into code, and keep it up to date as laws change. And some companies are doing that, but let's recognize that's extraordinarily expensive. It's complex, and if not done right, it's potentially fragile. So my takeaway here is do treat it as infrastructure, because that is what it in fact is. This is the approach behind KID's sort of compliance development kit, right? We've built our own rule engine, covers many thousands of legal sources across the globe. It integrates those age requirements directly into our product logic. So we know how to handle this in terms of what's enabled by default, what requires verified parental consent to unlock, what must be restricted based on age or regulations for each market. So you want your infrastructure to stay adaptive. As these regulations change, the configurations need to update along with it. All right, so the result here, though, is this. It's not a smaller product behind a compliance wall, right? It's a larger addressable audience. And this is where I think a lot of folks think safety actually harms conversion, but actually age appropriate by default, audible under enforcement and delivered without building or maintaining compliance logic in-house actually expands your addressable market. So let me tie these 3 layers basically all back together. Orchestration gives you the flexibility to meet any regional requirement, be it the bright line bands or regulated access through age appropriate designs. And the point here is to build that in a way that doesn't require re-engineering. Right? It's just going to be very challenging if you do. Interoperability is about solving the user friction and the problem that otherwise would harm your conversion, and positions you for reusable credentials for an ecosystem that has just arrived. It's now available. Adaptation is where compliance becomes a potential growth and business accelerant, where knowing a user's age isn't a limitation. It's actually the foundation for serving a larger audience with a better product. And if you take one thing from this section, it would be this. The companies that treat this as infrastructure and not a series of one-off compliance projects, they're the ones that are going to move the quickest. They're potentially the ones that are going to spend the least. And they're certainly going to be the ones in the strongest position as enforcement accelerates through 2026.